Yes, a very warm welcome to all of you here in the Balie. This evening will be conducted in English, of course. We're very happy that you're here. My name is Yuri Albrecht. I'm the director of the Balie, and I'm very happy to interview Dr. Jackson Katz tonight. I'm very, very happy that he's here. Very warm welcome to you, Dr. Katz. And I'll give a short introduction about our speaker of tonight. Then I'm going to have a conversation with Jackson Katz, and then, as usual, you can join in with questions and remarks later on. If you don't want to be seen on the internet with your questions, because there's a very warm welcome to the viewers at home, we always air our evenings on our website. So then you might ask Jackson Katz afterwards in the bar, maybe a question. But otherwise, remember that you're on the internet. Katz is an educator, author and cultural critic who has spent decades challenging the harmful norms around masculinity. He was the first man to minor in women's studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's widely known for his work engaging men in conversations about gender equality and violence prevention. Through his books, lectures, films, Katz encourages audiences to rethink how culture shapes ideas about power and responsibility. He wrote, among many other books, a book which made a great impression on me about 10 years ago. It's called Men Enough, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. That's 2016, that's more than 10 years ago. I would say that's a prophetic book, actually, if you look at the world today. Very recently, he brought out this book, Every Man, Why Violence Against Women is a Man's Issue. And I think the subtitle is very, very telling, I think. And one of the reasons I'm very happy that Dr. Katz is here tonight and that I'm interviewing him, because it is a man's issue. And I'm a man, so I'm very happy that we can engage in this conversation. I would leave it at this. I'm very happy again. Very warm welcome to Jackson Katz. He will introduce himself further.
Well, this is very special for me. Thank you very much, Yuri. Thanks very much for welcoming me to Balie. What a great institution. I mean, I've just had a very brief glimpse of the incredible people you have coming through here on a regular basis, and the political, intellectual, cultural, global people. Fantastic. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you all for coming. And I have some familiar faces. Hens and Sander are men in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands who are doing work on masculinity and men's violence and a whole range of other related topics. I know there's other people who have their own interest and areas of engagement, and in our conversation, we'll get a chance to talk about a whole range of subjects. So I hope you want to join in the conversation at whatever level you choose. I'm going to just say a few things about the thesis of my book, Every Man, Why Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue, give you some sort of background on that, and then Yuri and I will talk about that, but also expand it to the politics of presidential masculinity and Donald Trump and all the other issues of the moment. And I know today's big municipal elections throughout the Netherlands, and I know you probably don't know the results yet, right? So politics are in the air. Wherever we live. So I also just want to say my book, Every Man, the publication date in the United States is tomorrow. So it's literally being published tomorrow. And here I have the version of the American version. It looks like this. It looks, I think, better than the British version. And Sander and his colleagues are going to be publishing a Dutch version in sometime in the summer or the fall. So hopefully, if you're interested, you can check it out. So basically, a big part of my work since I was a 19-year-old, which is a long time ago, was trying to figure out how to get more men to start standing up and speaking out about men's violence against women. Because even as a young guy, I was clear that it was a problem that the issue of sexual assault and rape and domestic violence and sexual harassment were understood to be women's issues that some good men need to help out with. In fact, I think calling, for example, rape a women's issue is a subtle form of victim blaming. Men commit 99% of rape, okay? Whether the victims are women, which they are in approximately 90% of cases, or men, which they are in approximately 10%, and non-binary people fit in there somewhere. Whatever the sex of the victim or the survivor, the perpetrators of rape are overwhelmingly men. So, for example, calling rape a women's issue when 99% of it is done by men has a very powerful political effect. The political effect is it shifts the focus off of the group doing it, the group that has more power that is doing it, and puts it onto the group that's experiencing it. And that, to me, even as a young guy, was obviously wrong. And if we want to dramatically change the levels of domestic and sexual violence, engaging men in that process is not an optional move. It is the center of the work. And by the way, I used to use the word engaging men. Some of you have heard this term. There's a Men Engage Alliance. That's a global alliance. And engaging men has been the terminology that people often have used about men's participation. And I have to say, I don't like the term engaging men. You know why? Because it's too passive. Because when I hear the word engage, and again, I appreciate I'm speaking in English and I speak fast, so I appreciate that you're hanging with me. But when I hear the word engage, it makes me think of a conversation. Engage in a conversation. How many decades are we going to engage men in conversations about this subject? We need to do more than engage in a conversation. So I say we need to engage and mobilize men. We need way more from men. We need way more men who have the guts to start standing up and speaking out on this subject matter at all levels of leadership in our societies. There's been a deafening silence among men, powerful men, around this subject matter. And that has got to change. Or we can just go on for decades with the status quo and the femicides and the sexual violence scandals and sexual abuse survivors and the shelters being filled up. Really? This is the status quo that we have to live with? I don't think so. And I feel like we have to do much more. And the missing piece has been men's leadership. Women's leadership, in a multiracial, multi-ethnic sense, here in the Netherlands, all throughout Europe, all over the world, women's leadership over the past, let's say half century with antecedents prior to that. Women's leadership has been utterly transformative in a world historical sense around this subject matter, whether it's the promotion of gender equality and the transformation of centuries, millennia of patriarchal societies, subordination of women, whether it's gender equality or the movements against domestic and sexual violence, which started essentially in the 1970s. Women's leadership has been utterly world-changing. There's no doubt about any of that. But men's leadership has not met the moment, not even close. And so that's the focus of my work. And my focus of my book is to try to explain in very brief terms and concise terms why that is, like why is there so much domestic and sexual violence, and then what can we do about it? So it's both a social history and brief analysis, and a call to action, in particular for men. Now, I just want to give you a few highlights, and then and you'll see there's way more to all of this, but I just want to give you some highlights of the sort of the conceptual shift that I'm suggesting needs to happen, both in the pages of this book, but also in my work and others' work more generally. And I can't wait to talk about Trump and all the crazy stuff happening in the political world too, because it's all connected. I spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about the language that we use to think, speak, and write about domestic and sexual violence. Because if we want to get to a new paradigm, a new framework of thinking about these issues, not as women's issues that good men help out with, but as men's issues, and again, I understand they're also women's issues, but if we want to get to centering the need for men to be working and speaking out on this matter, we have to critically examine how we're currently thinking about the subject. And I think there's no better way to change a paradigm or to examine the existing paradigm than to critically examine the language. So let me give you a handful of examples of the ways in which the current uses of language, and I'm an English speaker, so I'm going to speak to the English, but how the current way that we talk and think and speak keeps us in the old paradigm or the old way of thinking. So you'll often hear people, when they talk about domestic and sexual violence, use passive language. They'll talk about how many women in the Netherlands were raped last year, rather than how many men raped women in the Netherlands. They'll say in the Amsterdam, the Utrecht, or the Rotterdam school district, how many girls in school were sexually harassed last year, rather than how many boys sexually harassed girls in schools, or how many girls sexually harassed girls. Or they'll say things like, in the country of the Netherlands, how many teenage girls got pregnant last year, rather than how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls. In each case, the use of passive language has a very powerful political effect, and the political effect is the shift in focus off of the group with more power onto the group with less. This is not a coincidence. It's not sloppy thinking. It's how power works, through stealth or invisibility or the shifting of accountability off of itself. And those of us who want to shift the paradigm, who want to reduce the levels of domestic and sexual violence dramatically, not at the margins, we have to make visible what has been rendered invisible in the discourse, in the conversation. So the very act of using active language is itself a political act, because you're changing the focus. Even the phrase violence against women, the phrase violence against women is problematic. I don't use this phrase without critiquing it. What's missing from the phrase violence against women? Anybody? Men. In other words, in linguistic terms, the active agent is absent. Violence against women is a passive phrase, right? Violence against women is a bad thing that happens to women, but nobody's doing it to them. They're just experiencing it, kind of like the weather. But if you insert the active agent, men, you have a new phrase, men's violence against women. It doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but it's more accurate, isn't it? It's more honest. Now, I know there's women's violence against women. There's mother-to-daughter child abuse. There's female-to-female peer-to-peer harassment, abuse, and violence. And none of it is acceptable. None of it is good. None of it is okay. But the vast majority of violence against women in the world, and the overwhelming majority of sexual violence against women and girls in the world, is done by men. But you wouldn't know that from the phrase violence against women, because men are not part of it. Hang on. After I finish, I'll open up and you can ask, okay? Anything, or say anything. But there's a problem with the phrase men's violence against women, because even though it's more accurate and honest, it can sometimes backfire, especially if women are the ones who are demanding it of men. For example, some men can get really defensive in the face of that level of honest language, and they can push back. And sometimes women know this, not sometimes, a lot of times women know this, and they're either fearful because of potential retribution from a man, like, who knows, it could be a violent retribution, but just even in personal relationships, in friendships, in workplaces, in any number of different social settings, I think a lot of women know that men can be defensive about this, and they choose their battles. They say, you know what, it's not worth getting into an argument about this. I'm not going to say every time, point out that, you know, the active agent is missing, and what about men? And I appreciate that and understand that. So I'm not saying, as a man, as a white man, I'm not saying that women need to use active language, and it's, you know, that would be totally unfair of me. But I think that one of the roles that men can and should be playing is that we can say some of these things in a way that women can't sometimes. And often we can be heard saying some of these things in a way that women often can't. And I know that that's not fair, and I know a lot of women are very frustrated by this, but it's the world we live in. And if we have more men who are willing to say the things that I'm saying and be more direct and honest about this language, then it'll take some of the pressure off of the women. In other words, if it becomes more normal to hear men saying the things that I'm saying and talking like I'm talking, it'll take the pressure off of women to be the ones that always have to bring it up, always have to push for people to have honest language and honest conversations about this subject matter. You follow me on this? It's pretty basic stuff, isn't it? Now, let me also address this question of, is this anti-male? I'll answer my own question. No, it's not anti-male. Not for 1 second is it anti-male to say that we need to tell the truth and be honest about what's going on. And you know what? Some men will say in response to women and men and others saying, you know, men's violence against women is a big problem. They'll say, well, what about violence against men? That's a big problem too. That's the whataboutism. And by the way, I have a whole chapter in my book called Pushback, and it's Pushback chapter is devoted to me outlining the predictable responses to some of the things that I'm writing in the book and saying right now, and giving people a way to respond to those predictable pushbacks, because this isn't quantum physics. I'm sorry, it's not that complicated. Some of the predictable things, like what about men? What about violence against men? It's like, yeah, we've thought of that. We've thought of that. In fact, men are the primary victims, and young men are the primary victims of most forms of violence, with the interpersonal violence, with the exception of domestic and sexual violence. But when it comes to murder, attempted murder, assault, aggravated assault, knife crime in your country, gun violence in my country, the primary victims are men and young men across the class and race spectrum in various ways, right? But the primary perpetrators are also men and young men, because the same system that produces men who abuse women produces men who abuse other men. And guess what? The same system that produces men who abuse women and produces men who abuse other men produces men who abuse themselves. Because, for example, suicide is violence turned inward. And so if we want to talk about the crisis globally of men hurting themselves and men's emotional and mental health challenges, which are all real, including in your country and mine, it's all connected. And the people in my space who have been doing the masculinities work and the men's violence against women work, we've been talking about this for decades. We haven't had a public platform. My book is the first book published by a major publisher in the English language in the whole world by a man about men's violence against women. How pathetic is that, by the way? My book was published initially, this book, Every Man, was published in the UK by Penguin last year, a year ago. And the publication of that book in the UK was the first time anybody in my world had published a mainstream book by a man about men's violence against women. This is 2025. That was 2025. And I think a lot of people, including a lot of women that I know, who are so frustrated about the fact that men don't talk about this stuff. Men aren't out there speaking out. Men aren't, hitting the barriers and hitting the protests about the incredible ongoing tragedy and travesty of men's violence against women. They'll often say, where are the men? Why aren't men speaking up? And I'm not defending the fact that men aren't speaking up. I'm trying to understand it. I'm trying to write about it. I'm trying to give solutions to it. But one of the reasons why men don't speak up is because men don't speak up. And that's not just a tautology. Men don't speak up because there's disincentives for men to speak up. We have to change the incentive structures, because right now the incentive structures are for men to speak up, and I'm using speak up broadly, because there's so many different particulars that you can say in terms of men speaking up. But, I mean, there are so many disincentives. The only incentives, or the most powerful incentives for men to speak up, is because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's human rights. It's concern for and compassion for other human beings who happen to be women. It's it's doing the right thing. It's like it's an internal reward, and I appreciate that. There's an internal reward for doing the right thing. And in some cases, you're going to get support from people around you, from women who are going to say, "I'm really happy that you spoke up. I'm really happy that you provided leadership." Okay, so that's the incentive structure. The disincentives is like a long list of disincentives. Conflict with your friends, status hierarchies within male culture. You could be damaging your place in the status hierarchy. If you're a young man, you're exposed to, on a daily basis on social media, mocking and ridicule. Men like me get mocked and ridiculed on a daily or an hourly or minutely basis for standing with women, for standing for gender justice. And you probably know this, but I'll just give you a handful of examples of the things that men and young men who speak up and challenge other men's abusive, misogynist behavior, they get called. Simps, beta males, cucks, soy boys, virtue signalers. Do you know this language? This is the language that young men who are immersed in, whether it's the manosphere or other forms of social media, are hearing on a regular basis. And they're not just hearing it from the Andrew Tates of the world, although they are hearing it from the Andrew Tates of the world. They're also hearing it from Joe Rogan, from Jordan Peterson, from a whole range of other so-called, intellectuals who are mocking men like me. Even I know this, even from my long experience in this work. Somebody on social media or wherever this is posted, there's going to be people watching it. Who's this beta male? Who's this beta male telling men to be just cucks? And it's so ridiculous. And I'm an old guy and I don't really care. And actually, I didn't care when I was a young guy either. You know what I mean? I was pretty confident as a young man. But guys do care. A lot of guys do care. And not just 16-year-old boys and 21-year-old young men. They do care what their friends think of them. They do care that they have a standing within their peer culture. And this goes for adult men, including adult men with power and authority and cultural influence. There's an awful lot of adult men who are really incredibly impressive as leaders and as humans on so many different dimensions. But when it comes to this subject matter, all of a sudden they're inarticulate. They can't even string together 3 sentences on this subject coherently. And they often, what they do in the face of this subject matter, because of their anxiety, is they'll often defer to women. They'll say, oh, you know what, Ms. Jones knows a lot more about this subject, so I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ms. Jones, and she's going to talk about this subject, right? Now, I believe that men in positions of leadership need to be promoting women in positions of leadership, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is the guy doesn't know what to say, he doesn't know how to lead, and his anxiety leads him to hand off to Ms. Jones, not because he's trying to support women's leadership, but because he doesn't know how to exercise his own leadership. You follow me on this? This is what's one of the things that's going on all throughout the world, is you have all these men who are in positions of incredible potential influence who don't know what to say, they don't know what to do, they know that there's a disincentive to speak up because there's going to be disapproval among their peer culture, it's going to cause potentially, conflict in their relationships, their friendships, their work relationships. And a lot of men, consciously or unconsciously, do a cost-benefit analysis, and that they weigh the incentives and the disincentives, and they often remain silent. And so what we have is a collective deafening silence throughout the world from men who are in a position to not be silent and to therefore be more effective. Couple last points, and then I'll turn. I'll join Yuri for our conversation. And I know that I'm the American in the room, right? I'm well aware that I'm the American in the room, unless there might be other Americans. I'm just saying, I know that my style is culturally specific. Is that a fair self-assessment? You're like looking at it thinking, oh my God, this guy's an American. You can just tell. Is that obvious? All right. Thank you. There are still good Americans. Let me just say that. Regardless of what you might see on the in the news. No, you know that. Thank you. Another point that has to be. Thank you, Yuri. Another point that has to be brought into the conversation is that men is not a homogeneous category. There is no such category as men. There's hierarchies between and among men. We have to acknowledge that. There are racial and ethnic differences between and among men, religious differences among men, socioeconomic differences among men, sexual orientation and identity issues among men. You follow me? So I happen to be white, heterosexual, and male, right? So I happen to occupy some of the major categories of privilege. But that doesn't mean that all men do. There's plenty of men who don't. And it's not fair to just posit men as this universal social position without complicating it by race and class and ethnicity and all the other categories, you understand? What that means also is in terms of designing programs or designing initiatives to address this issue, we can't just posit a one-size-fits-all solution because it's too complicated for that. There are some universals that I would argue for, like violence is wrong and it shouldn't get away with it and it should be socially unacceptable to use abuse and physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, period. I think those should be universal values. In fact, they are universal human rights issues. But I do think when we're fashioning solutions, we have to be more culturally competent and specific because it is complicated. And one of the ways it's complicated in the Dutch setting, and of course in the United States and other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, is so much of the rise of the right and the populist right in the current moment uses white men's sense of protector of white women against dark-skinned men's sexual threat. This is an old story in our species. This is not a new thing. And I talked about in the States. I've been talking about the captivity narratives from the 17th century, where white men were mobilized to rescue white women who had been captured, kidnapped, what have you, by Native Americans in response to the colonization and the violent brutality of the colonizers. So you follow me on this? So those white men as protectors of white women is one of the major tropes of Trumpism in the United States. For example, when he came down the escalator in 2015, and he said, the Mexicans, they're bringing their rapists. That's not a coincidence, that kind of language, because that's an old mechanism to try to mobilize white men against racial integration and ethnic integration and greater heterogeneity in societies. And this is happening in your country, it's happening in my country right as we speak. And again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because Yuri and I will talk about this, but to me, right-wing populism in the States, and I can speak authoritatively about it in the States more so than I can in Europe, but a huge part of Trumpism and right-wing populism is not just racist and white racial grievance against the increasing heterogeneity and racial and ethnic integration of the United States, which is already a multiracial society. It's men's resistance to feminism and men's resistance to feminist challenges to their cultural centrality and authority within the family and the larger society, and heteronormative heterosexual men's resistance to the LGBTQ revolution's challenges to white male heteronormative centrality. But unfortunately, what gets left out of the conversation so often in the conversation about racial grievance, that Trumpism and right-wing populism is a racial grievance movement, is the gender and sexual part of it, which is incredibly important. And I don't think we should leave it out because I think it's a central thing. And I'll just give you one data point. In the January 6th attempted insurrection of the United States Capitol, right? Of people arrested that day, January 6th, 2021, of the people arrested that day, for crimes committed that day, 93% were white, 86% were men. But almost nobody talks about the 86%. It's all about white people trying to take what they couldn't win through legal means, take it through force, right? This is not just in the quote-unquote mainstream media or the corporate media, whatever that is at this moment in history. This is in the left too, in the progressive media too. Very little discussion about the gendered aspects of right-wing populism, and that's a huge miss as far as I'm concerned, because gender is central to right-wing populism. Male, not white backlash, but white male backlash. And I know that people might want to talk about how women get mobilized into this and how the trad wife movement and how the complications of feminine identity within this crazy male-dominated space. But here we are. We need to be talking about all of this, and we need more men who are willing to talk about it. The last point, and I'll stop, and then I'll join Yuri. I've said this a couple different times, but I'll say it just to make sure that I say it for the record. Not only are these men's issues, they're leadership issues for men, right? And I think if there's such a thing as a global game changer in the prevention of domestic and sexual violence, to use that term, game changer? If there is such a thing, and again, I'm just positing this, if there is such a thing as one move that could really transform the world in terms of preventing domestic and sexual violence and harassment and sexual abuse of children and all that, it is defining it as a leadership expectation and not a hope. And what that means is if you're in a formal position of leadership, and leadership can be informal, I'm talking about the formal. An example of informal leadership is a 16-year-old boy is hanging with his friends, and one of his friends starts making misogynist comments about girls or young women, and that boy says to the friend, hey, that's not cool. The way you're talking about women, I'm not cool with that. That's an act of leadership by that 16-year-old boy. He's not in a formal position of leadership, but he's exercising leadership by saying this is not cool. But if you're in a formal position of leadership, in the corporate sector, in labor unions, in politics, in culture, in organizational life, in schools, wherever, if you're in a formal position of leadership, we should expect you have certain basic competencies. And when I say you in a position of leadership, that means everybody, women, men, non-binary people. But the key here is this is how we get men in the room. You define it as a leadership issue. You don't say, we hope that men will show up to this event or this training or read this book, because guess what? We've been hoping that for 50 years and it doesn't happen. There's only a tiny number of men. I've been to hundreds of conferences where I'm one of the few men right? Right? How many men read books about this subject, take courses on the university, go to conferences, immerse themselves in this? It's wildly disproportionately women at all of those things, isn't it? Okay? How do you get men in the room? You don't, offer free beer and hope they're going to show up, right? What you do is you say, we expect that of our leaders in this society. In the Netherlands in 2026, we are sick of domestic and sexual violence rates in our society, and as a country, we're saying we got to do this better. What that means is the people who are leaders in the formal positions of leadership need to have basic competencies so that they can enforce that national priority. Not because for the men, not because they're nice guys helping out the women. That's the old paradigm. The new paradigm is because they're leaders, they have to do it. And if they don't do it, they're not being good leaders. It has to be written into the job description. It has to be literally written into the job description of teachers and principals of schools and CEOs of companies and managers and directors of organizations that you're going to be expected to have basic competencies. And I'll just tell you the 3 competencies and then I'll stop. The 3 competencies that I'm saying, and I'm shorthanding here because there's more to it, right? The 3 competencies that every leader should have. And that's men, women, and others. But again, this is how men are going to get through the door. The 3 competencies are, 1, you need to be able to figure out within your sphere of influence how to support victims and survivors in whatever way possible. 2, you need to be able to interrupt misogynist abuse and hold abusers accountable whatever way possible. And by the way, accountability is not just legal accountability. There are other forms of accountability, restorative justice. There's all kinds of different ways. Social accountability that aren't necessarily locking somebody up, But you need to interrupt the abuse and hold the abusers accountable. You're the leader. But third, you have to set a tone and then sustain a tone within the group whereby misogynist abuse is seen as completely contrary to the group's values. Everybody in the group has a responsibility for their own behavior, but the leader has the most responsibility because they're the leader. What that means is they have to lead proactively, not just reactively, not just wait for an incident and then deal with it, but actually set a tone from the beginning as the leader of the organization, of the group, of the team, and say, this is how we do things here, and we're going to have a great experience here, but you have to know that you talk like this, you act like this, you treat each other like this, or others like this. It's not going to go well for you because that's not how we do things here. The leader has to do that proactively. If we get to the place where this becomes an expectation of everybody in positions of leadership, what will happen is all those men who would never have voluntarily signed up for courses in the university, reading the books, and doing all the work that I'm talking about in terms of learning about domestic and sexual violence and all this stuff, those men will walk through the door because they have to walk through the door because they're leaders or they're aspiring leaders. Some of them will walk through the door with their arms folded. Oh my God, I have to sit through another session where I'm told that men are bad and I'm sick of this. It doesn't matter how they walk through the door as long as they walk through the door. Because once they walk through the door, a lot of those men will learn how little that they knew about this subject. They'll learn how little they knew about themselves, about the relationship between men's violence against women and men's violence against other men, about suicide and mental health, for example, about the fact that the men's health movement, the very movement of men seeking help and making it more acceptable for men to get mental health treatment, all this is feminist-led women's health movement stuff that men are now building on. Do you understand this? The men's health movement is a direct outgrowth of the feminist-led women's health movement. How many people even know that? But if these guys walk through the door because they have to, they're going to learn a lot of this. And what's going to happen, hopefully, is a certain percentage of those men will emerge from these kinds of trainings with a completely new way of thinking about themselves and their potential for leadership. Do I think that there's going to be a mass movement of men working against men's violence against women? No, I don't think there is going to be a mass movement of men. I think the driving force behind gender equality and gender violence prevention is women, and it will be women. But I think those women globally need a critical mass of men to join them. And right now, we don't have a critical mass of men. We have a tiny number of men. But if we can increase the number of men to the critical mass that joins with the driving force of women, then you'll have the tipping point for dramatic social transformation all over the world on this subject matter. And guess what? Everybody will benefit. Women and girls will benefit, but men and boys will profoundly benefit as well. But we have to do better in terms of the engaging and mobilizing men piece if we're going to get anywhere close to that. That's my piece for now. So thank you for indulging me, and I'll turn it over to our conversation. say Yuri wanted to do this interview with me because he's a man and I'm a man, and we were setting a sort of an example, right? Like instead of having a woman be the one, interacting, it was two men, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful speech, being very precise, touching global issues, personal issues, and being very precise in language as well. It's obvious that you have been talking about these issues, thinking about these issues for decades. And it's wonderful that we get a short introduction about the things you've been phrasing. And phrasing is very, very important, as you just pointed out. More important, actually, than you would think. Of course, we know that's important. But let me start off a little bit, maybe first on the personal, and then get to the global. And it's all connected, like you just said, in this way. But you said you were very precise about the way you describe violence of men against women, or men against other men, but we're mainly talking about. And you pointed out that by leaving out the part of the perpetrator, you're actually enhancing the atmosphere in which violence can be sustained or even grow. You said, there was a phrase in between, you said that's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that we use this kind of language, because it's a language of people in power. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because you would think, you could think, well, I mean, people in power, it's just, the way our language is structured. It has to do with grammar or whatever. It's interesting that you point out that, no, it's no coincidence. I'm very intrigued by that part.
Absolutely. Sure. There's so much to this. I'll try to be concise.
There's so much we could go into. But this is one thing I just, by listening to you, I thought, hey, that's interesting. Because you're probably not aware of it, a lot of people.
Well, right. Well, and this is one of the reasons why, as an educator, whenever I have the opportunity to help people think about how they think, I always seize the opportunity, because if you help people think about how they think, it has exponential value. In other words, once you start thinking about language in a way that you hadn't been thinking about it, consciousness is kind of a one-way street. You can't unthink it. So after you hear some of these things, if you hadn't thought about some of this, or you read my book or whatever it is, you're going to be like, oh my God, I didn't, oh my God, it makes so much sense, and I hadn't really thought about it like that. And then you'll see it everywhere. Like, for example, the passive voice. You'll see passive voice everywhere. It'll jump out at you. By the way, I'll just give you another example of a linguistic practice that it's not even passive voice. It's just another linguistic practice. You'll see it in newspaper headlines of like a domestic violence homicide. It'll say something like, woman 37 killed by spouse. What's going on there? You're gendering the victim, woman, but you're degendering the perpetrator, the spouse. This happens a lot. Instead of saying woman, the parallel construction would say woman 37 killed by either husband or killed by man. But it says spouse. You follow me on this? This happens all the time. And again, you think to yourself, if you're thinking about this, you often think to yourself, was this intentional? Are they trying to figure out how not to implicate men in the linguistic discussions of this subject matter? And I don't think that's how it works. I think the way that power works through language is an institution of a culture that reinforces, typically, existing power structures. By definition, that's a basic sociolinguistic insight, which is language is not neutral. Language represents existing structures of power, and therefore critically examining how language is hiding culpability or responsibility is itself a political act. I would also say violence is almost always, in interpersonal violence especially, but we could even broaden it, but I'll for the sake of this discussion, I'll talk about interpersonal violence. It's instrumental, which is to say violence is not an end unto itself. It's a means to an end. In other words, violence is used for something. It's typically in an interpersonal relationship, it is used to either gain or maintain power, or to punish a person for transgressing against the authority of the person using the violence. So, for example, we know this from over 50 years of working with men who are abusive to, say, their wives and girlfriends, okay, in a heterosexual context. And again, I'm not a person who's done that work as a clinician or as a therapist or an educator. I'm not that person, but I have worked with people who do that work for decades. We know that men who are abusive to their wives or girlfriends are doing it intentionally in most cases. It's not just like they have the impulse control problem, they have an anger management problem, and they just go off. I'm not saying that people don't have bad tempers sometimes. I'm not saying that alcohol isn't involved sometimes. Obviously, there are those factors, but it's often a deliberate strategy of gaining or maintaining control or punishing her for transgressing against his authority. And we know this from decades of work. I mean, again, I know that's a little more complicated in some instances, but not that much more complicated. So the question becomes, when we're talking about reducing violence and men's violence, we have to think about why they're using violence in the first instance, because they're making a choice to use violence to get something, or because they don't have the capacity to get what they want in other way. By the way, can I also say, I've written about this in Ms. Magazine about the January 6th insurrection. Because the argument that I made was, because we have so much insight from the domestic and sexual violence movements that can be applied to other issues. So for example, January 6th, these men who stormed the Capitol, and a handful of women, couldn't get what they wanted through the democratic process. They lost an election. They couldn't get what they wanted through the democratic, so they tried to take it by force. This is exactly what happens in a relational context when a man is abusive to his wife or girlfriend. He's trying to get her to comply with his needs and his demands. If he can't, then he'll sometimes use violence or the threat of violence. It's very similar. The larger point here is that any discussion about violence, interpersonal violence, is a discussion about power, who has it, who doesn't have it, and how violence is used to either gain it, maintain it, or resist its imposition. And so this has implications for the language, it has implications for everything else, but that's, and by the way, can I also say, how many people have even heard this kind of conversation? Every day you pick up the newspapers, there's murders, there's violence, there's sexual assault scandals, there's Epstein files, there's Pellico case, there's tons of stuff happening in the news, right? And in the Netherlands, you have your own set of, right, femicides and domestic. This stuff should be on TV. People should be talking about this all the time. This shouldn't be because you go to a Balie event or you happen to find out about some guy who wrote a book. Do you know? But it's like not, this is not popular knowledge, what I'm saying. And by the way, in journalism schools in the United States, I can't speak to the Netherlands. You should learn this on the first day if you're taking a news writing class, okay, or a reporting class, or you should learn on the first day that using passive language around subject matter like this is a political act that reinforces existing structures of power. But you think this is taught in journalism schools? Only here and there. There might be a professor here, a feminist professor there who assigns writing on this or whatever, but it's not systematized. It's not like expected that you go through coursework on this. And if I was to recommend, for example, in the Dutch setting, I would go to all the journalism schools and I would say, what are you teaching? What are you not teaching? Is it mandatory or is it an elective that you take a course where this is part of the content? Because these are structural problems that we all as societies are not providing young people and people who are emerging into the professions with this knowledge. Why should you have to go to a conference to learn this? This should be learned in school if you're going to be a journalist, don't you think?
Mm-hmm. It has to do with the basics of journalism and of writing and of power structures.
I'm just going to get my water.
I understand. Yes. There. But it goes of course, it goes further than this. It's the interpersonal. It's the issues of men, acting out their anger or or other things. But you brought some fragments of work you did. Some fragments we could watch, and you brought also one part which I think you made yourself about popular culture and violence. And I thought we'd just have a look and take it from the personal and the use of language to the cultural. And maybe we can have a look if you agree on one of your parts you brought.
The men's bodies, that one?
Yeah.
The gun size?
Yeah.
Okay.
For instance?
Sure. Can I just give you?
Because we can move into the cultural sort of.
That'll be our shift. But let me just give you a setup for what the clip that we're about to share.
Yes, please,
okay?
please,
okay.
yes.
So I make educational documentaries among my work, right? And I made a film. My first major piece was called Tough Guys. And guys is spelled Guise, Tough Guys, Violence, Manhood, and American Culture. And it came out in 2000. And it's widely used in North America and other English-speaking countries. And I'm kind of a media literacy pioneer in that respect. And feminist media literacy was a thing earlier, starting in the 1970s, where a woman named Jean Kilbourne, I don't know if anybody knows any of this, but Jean Kilbourne, American woman, Jean Kilbourne is one of the pioneers of feminist media literacy. She put together a slide lecture, and I use the word slide lecture advisedly, because this is way before PowerPoint. My son, for example, makes fun of me when I talk about slide lectures, because it's like so 20th century dad, But anyhow, Jean Kilbourne made made a slide lecture that became a film. It was called Killing Us Softly, Advertising Images of Women in the 1970s. It's been updated subsequently several times. But it was looking at ways in which women were represented in media and the ways in which the narrow definition of femininity, especially much back then, even more so than today, much whiter, much thinner, much more girlish and waifish than real women in the real world, and how that image, that idealized image of femininity contributes to so many problems that women have, body image, dysmorphia, and it also sets women up to, because men are consuming those images too, and expecting women to be taking up less space, right? You know all this, right? Anyways, Jean was one of the pioneers of this. I saw Jean's slide lecture when I was in university, and I remember thinking, oh my God, this is so interesting. And then in my 20s, when I was developing my work in the gender violence prevention space, I did a whole lot of research into, because I understand the power of media, so I was looking at, okay, what are the images and narratives about masculinities in media that are shaping boys' and men's understanding of what it means to be a man? Because if women are being influenced by media images, of course men are too, but people hadn't been looking at that piece of it. And so I made a slide lecture in the early 90s that I called My Gun's Bigger Than Yours, Images of Violence and Manhood in the Media. And then in the late 90s, I worked together with my colleagues to make this into a film, and it became Tough Guys. And what you're going to see now is a clip from Tough Guys 2, which came out in 2014. So it's, you'll say it could be a little dated because, it's 12 years ago. And we're making Tough Guys 3 right now. I'm writing with my colleague and co-writer. We're writing Tough Guys 3 right now. And that's a big challenge because the fire hose of media narratives and imagery and Trump and social media, and just so much to talk about. It's hard to do it in one short, 70-minute film. But the clip you're going to see is from Tough Guys 2, and it's a clip that shows how the definitions of manhood have changed over the decades in the way that media narrates that, and the insights you can gain if you start thinking critically about those narratives in the context of this kind of feminist understanding of gender. That's the setup for this clip. There's some violence in the clip, so if anything makes you uncomfortable, you can turn away or look down. It'll go by. But this is all mainstream stuff, so you know what I mean. You can get this stuff on TV, and it's U.S. based. But I just wanted to say that.
Do you got the one, Berend? Yeah.
Upping the ante. sculpted, pumped up, and ripped. And look at toy action figures. If you look at the Star Wars toy figurines that kids played in the 1970s and contrast them with the Star Wars toy figurines that are being marketed to kids today, you see a dramatic shift. Well, look at the body of G.I. Joe. A study done in the late 1990s found that over the past 50 years, the size of G.I. Joe's biceps in real-life equivalents increased from 12.2 inches in 1964 to 15.2 inches in 1974 to 16.4 inches in 1994 and up to 26.8 inches by 1998. If you wanted a comparison to a real person, the biceps of someone like The Rock are reportedly only about 20 inches. Over the same time period, there's been a ratcheting up of violence itself. We've gone from pistols in the 1940s to larger weaponry in the 1970s, to the increasing militarization of these weapons in the 80s and 90s, to the larger-than-life heavy metal killing machines we have today.
Mustn't be afraid to dream of the bigger, darling. Say hello to my little friend.
We've seen video game violence go from the benign aggressions of Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and Asteroids to the unimaginable and hyper-realistic bloodbaths of today's game. We've gone from the comparatively orderly sport of boxing to today's #1 fighting sport, the street fighting viciousness of mixed martial arts and cage fighting. Popular men's sports often seem to be less about healthy competition than about proving toughness through physical force and violence, and dominating and humiliating the opposition. Then, on a parallel track, we've seen porn culture go from the softcore sexism of Hugh Hefner's brand of hedonistic masculinity in the 1950s to the hardcore misogyny and sexualized brutality in the gonzo porn that is so popular with guys today.
Dude, I'm kind of uncomfortable watching this with you. Dude, by the way.
You have a long-standing cultural narrative that says being a man is about sexual conquest.
So did you bang her? Oh yeah, I banged her. That's what a man does, okay?
You need to stop being a pussy and nail her, okay?
How do you not see the point? There's the point.
The message to young men here is that actually caring about girls and women is unmanly and gay.
I need a little bit more time with Carly. There, I said it, okay? And I know you think that's lame, but can you please just give me one more day?
That's not lame, bro. That's gay.
What most discussions about violence miss is how interconnected this larger story about manhood is. How it creates a kind of all-pervasive cultural script that says sexual conquest, physical toughness, force, and violence are legitimate ways for men to achieve and maintain power and control. We're used to seeing the glamorization of hypermasculine posturing. We're not nearly as used to thinking about the unglamorous, ugly, mean-spirited, and violent ways these images play out in the real world.
That leads me to, because if we look at what's happening, and you've been addressing that in your lecture as well, there's positive developments, of course, but if you look at the backsliding of after decades of cultural influence here, and if you see, and I want to move a little bit into connecting this to the Trump election. Because not too long ago we had here a philosopher from Kiev, a wonderful man, Volodymyr Yermolenko, a philosopher, and he put it to me that we were discussing in whole, how on earth could people vote for somebody who is a rapist, has been convicted for it, who's obviously, stating, grab him by the pussy and gets elected. And he said to me, it's not that they don't care, it's a promise by Trump. A promise, they vote for it on purpose, because he promises transgression against women. And I thought, hey, that's a really disturbing thought. And I wonder how you look upon the fact you've been studying this for decades, actively battling this issue. How do you look upon the recent political, and it's a second term, of course, but and connected to violence against women by men?
Okay, that's great. No, I appreciate the question. There's multi-layers. I would say
And you've written about this 10 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I could see. I mean, in fact, my most recent film, which I know we're not going to see it right now, but my most recent film was called The Man Card. 50 Years of Gender Power in the American Presidency is the new subtitle. Is we were looking at Trump was just the most exaggerated recent manifestation of a phenomenon that was already in place in American politics for decades, which is the ways in which the Republican Party was able to mobilize male support, especially white male support, based not just on racial grievance, but on gender grievance, on masculinity. The Republican Party markets themselves as the party of real men. And they have feminized the Democratic Party in the popular discourse. And so the way that people understand, if you want to just simple binary terms in American presidential politics, the Republican Party is the men's party, the Democratic Party is the women's party, and the party of non-masculine men. And this is a very important point, because it's not about specific policy positions that people vote. It's identity, and white male identity is the heart of the Republican Party. And so the series of candidates, for example, who have been successful at the presidential level in the Republican Party over the past, 40 plus years, the three most successful electorally: Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. In all three cases, those three men were performing a certain kind of traditional masculinity, right? And that wasn't a coincidence. The Republican Party knows that to get working class votes, especially working class male votes, for the party of tax cuts for the wealthy, you can't present yourself as the party of the tax cuts for the wealthy. You have to present yourself as the party that cares about the average guy and the everyman. And so Ronald Reagan was, presented himself as a cowboy, and because he was in Hollywood films, there was imagery surrounding, Ronald Reagan that he was a cowboy. You know what I mean? He was an actor playing the role of a cowboy. He wasn't a cowboy. George W. Bush, this is more than you asked for, Yuri, but George W. Bush, when he ran for president in 2000, so George W. Bush is the son of privilege and old money on the East Coast. Okay, he grew up in part in Texas because his father had moved to Texas in the oil boom in Texas. But he's from an old money East Coast family, George W. Bush, right? And he went to Yale University and Harvard Business School. 2 weeks before George W. Bush announced his run for the presidency, he and his wife bought a ranch in Crawford, Texas. And what they did is they bought a photo op so they could show George W. Bush wearing cowboy hats, clearing brush on the ranch, getting in and out of pickup trucks, just like Ronald Reagan would do in his Santa Barbara ranch, because they were trying to make the case that George W. Bush is a man of the people, not a wealthy East Coast aristocrat. You follow me? And it worked. It worked. Donald Trump doesn't mobilize the same imagery because he doesn't have the cowboy narrative or anything like that, or the Western narrative. His image is the corporate CEO, the tough businessman who knows how to make decisions and make deals and fire people. And I don't know how much you know about The Apprentice, the TV show that introduced Donald Trump to the mass audience in the United States, right? 14 seasons of The Apprentice, where Donald Trump was, "You're fired." You know about this?
A TV show, yeah.
Yes. Okay. If you read the narratives of some of the people who were involved in the making of that TV show, it was totally scripted. They had to do dozens and dozens of takes. In other words, Mark Burnett, the producer of that show, they had incredible influence at creating the character of Donald Trump, the corporate CEO who knows business and knows how to make deals. That's how he was sold to the American public. You talk to a lot of Americans and you say, why did you vote for Donald Trump? He's a businessman and he knows how to get things done. And we have this sclerotic, government, where people can't, they can't get out of their own way. We need a businessman to come in there. They don't know anything about Donald Trump's personal, 6 bankruptcies, and, he inherited $400 million from his father. They don't really care about that. They know the image of Donald Trump. It's all narrative. Anyways, I would also say about the to specific of your question, there are some people and some men who were thrilled by the transgressive nature of Trump. In other words, Trump gave them permission to express their racism, to express their homophobia, to express their sexism. There's no doubt about that. There are others, but I would not say that all the people who voted for Trump are in that category. I would say there are others, for example, evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians, 80% of whom voted for Donald Trump. It was transactional, and a lot of them knew. Some of them were so deluded that they actually think that he's the messenger of God, and he's brought here by the Almighty to do the Lord's work. I mean, there are people who believe that, right? And I'm not even going to dignify that position with a serious response. But I would say that others in the evangelical right were very transactional. They didn't care that Donald Trump was, a multi-adulterous, potentially sexually assaultive person. If he could get them the Supreme Court justices who would overturn Roe v. Wade, which is women's right to abortion, then it's worth kind of like dealing with the fact that he's not the nicest person, if you know what I'm saying. It was very intentional and politically sophisticated as opposed to delusional. So there are those people. And then there's lots of other people who just didn't care that much about the other stuff. They were just like, I just want a president who's going to cut my taxes and deregulate business. And even though this guy personally is kind of I don't like him and I don't respect him and he's not a good role model for our kids, I'm going to support him for other reasons.
But then there's the part where he actually wins elections by being actively misogynist, by being actively open about that you should abuse women, and that's something which some voters actually endorsed. And if you think about the fact that this is spreading, we have these parties here in the Netherlands. We have them. So the problem you're addressing for a long time, the fact that some men are actively acting out their hatred to women in a sexual way, in a violent way, is being, in our culture, being so accepted that you can actually win elections with it.
No, I agree with you, and I think it was a catastrophe. Donald Trump's election was a catastrophe for many different reasons, but in terms of the movements of the feminist movements and the movements against domestic and sexual violence, an absolute catastrophe that he was elected for many reasons, symbolically, but also practically in terms of cutbacks to programs and funding and everything else. I absolutely think that. But one thing, a related point, Yuri, in the 2016 election, when Donald Trump was running for the Republican nomination for president, because this gets to some of the dynamics within male peer culture that keep men silent, right? I don't know if any of you followed the primary elections in the United States when Donald Trump was running for the Republican nomination. It was like, at one point, there was like 16 candidates, and Donald Trump just attacked the masculinity of all of his opponents. He ridiculed and mocked them in all the debates. I don't know if you saw any of the debates, but this was his strategy. It was successful. What he did was he mocked and ridiculed the guys that he was running against. And what we know from bullying, for example, from bullying, both research and advocacy over the last 30 years, is people are much more likely to identify with the bullied than with the bullied, especially because they're intimidated, because they know that if they identify with the person being bullied, the kid being bullied, they're potentially going to become bullied themselves. So there's an impulse, even though you might not like the bully, to want to sort of identify with the bully to self-protect, okay? So what happened was when he verbally attacked these men, these fellow, and women, there was one woman, but his fellow Republican nominee, candidates, you follow me? The message to men was, how are you going to support the guy who just got mocked and ridiculed on stage and couldn't even defend himself? You're going to much more want to identify with the bully, the strong man who just mocked the other guy, as opposed to identifying with the guy who just got, frankly, in gender terms, emasculated. And that's how he stormed his way to the nomination. And so to this day, in the Republican Party, and not just in the political realm itself, but in media, like right-wing media and in social media, if men take a stand against Donald Trump, they're not just ridiculed and, they're not just sort of attacked for being disloyal to the dear leader. They're mocked as failed men. They're wimpy, they're soft, they're weak, because Donald Trump he represents the strong man. And if you're not supporting him and you're a man, your masculinity is then threatened. And in the absence of men publicly saying what I'm saying, talking about this in these explicit terms, because people in the Democratic Party and the people on the left more generally talk a lot about this in private, or it's not like people never say any of this, but it's not part of the public conversation until fairly recently, because it is now, and I pay attention to this very closely, because, for example, me getting my writing into the mainstream is very hard. Like, most of my stuff gets published in Ms. Magazine, which is a feminist magazine. And people will say to me, why do you publish in Ms.? Men don't read Ms., or very few men read Ms. Why don't you publish in places where men read? It's like, because they won't publish it. That's why. I mean, that's the reason. And so, in other words, getting through the filters of male editors and male producers and, TV and other, media, and women too, I mean, it's not just men, is itself an uphill fight. But I think a lot of men are intimidated, and they're intimidated into silence because they know that if you take on somebody like that, you're taking a big risk with your sort of personal standing, and if you're a Republican especially, with your career, because they can punish you so badly, and not just in the moment, but even in subsequent elections. If you're seen as being disloyal to the dear leader in his moment of need, you're going to have a hard time in subsequent elections getting those people to vote for you.
So this mechanism of toxic masculinity, where we're talking about actually, where you're bullied into complying with the leader of the real man, or that ties in, I think, with your work for decades, and with the very personal, of course. That if you don't, if you're not aware of these things, you're going to be unable to stand the heat in a peer group. Is this what you describe as the bystander approach, the chapter 6 in the book, where I'm trying to get to what we men could do about this mechanism, and whether it's a huge political thing, whether it's the election of the most powerful man in the world, or whether it's among friends or at home, but how should we respond to this? How should I respond to this?
Good question. So the bystander approach, which Yuri just referred to. So I'm one of the architects of what's called the bystander approach. Sometimes people use the word bystander intervention. Some people are familiar with any of this? Does that ring a bell or anything? Not
I'm
really?
now after reading your book, but okay, I wasn't before.
Okay, thank you. So the bystander approach is an approach to the prevention of domestic and sexual violence and harassment that I'm one of the early architects of in the field. And my program that I created in 1993, called the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program, which was in the sports culture, and it became the first program in professional athletics in North America, and the first program in all the U.S. military services. But the main tool that we used, or one of the key tools that we used in the training of young men, initially was only focused on young male athletes because of their status, because of male athletes' status within the larger culture. It wasn't because sports has a problem, which they do. It's because I was trying to figure out how can we get more men to start speaking up? And if we get men who already have status in their peer culture to speak up, it'll make it easier for others. So sports was the reason. The reason for going into sports. Anyhow, when we were working with men in the sports culture, initially, the question is, what are we going to say to these young men? It became mixed gender, but it was initially all men. What are we going to say to them that invites them into the conversation rather than indicts them for being potential rapists and abusers? So invite rather than indict. You get that, right? That's calling in good behavior rather than calling out bad behavior. We're saying we need more men with the courage and the strength to speak up. Anyhow, the bystander approach was an approach that a professor of mine in graduate school had been looking at as an approach to middle school, which is 13 and 14-year-olds, bullying prevention. And what that did by the bystander approach with the young kids was, and the bullying issue, was Instead of focusing on the kid doing the bullying and the kid experiencing the bullying, they focused on all the kids around the kid doing it and all the kids around the kid experiencing it. And the goal was to get the kids around the kid doing the bullying to make it clear to that kid that what he, she, or they were doing was not okay, not because they were going to get in trouble with the authority figure, like the teacher or the principal, who's the external agent of authority who's going to come into the peer culture and remove the offending party, but because the peer culture was going to police itself. Kids were going to make it clear to other kids, you can't treat kids like this. This is not cool. And you know what? We're not impressed by this. You gotta get your act together. And the goal was to get kids around the kid experiencing the bullying to make it clear to them, what's happening to you is wrong, and I don't support it, we don't support it, what can we do to help? And the beauty of that approach is that everybody in a given group had a role to play. It wasn't just confined to the person doing it and the person experiencing it. And so what we did in the domestic and sexual violence field is we imported that and said, to men, we'd say, look, you yourself, maybe you're not abusive to your wife or your girlfriend, or you, because a lot of men will say, I don't rape women, I don't abuse my girlfriend, this isn't my problem, why are you talking to me like this? It's like we would say, okay, if you yourself are not abusive, that's good. But it's not good enough, because what are you doing to make it clear to the guys around you, your friends, your teammates, your classmates, your coworkers, your colleagues? What are you doing to make it clear to them that you're not okay with their behavior if their behavior crosses the line? And if you're not saying something, if you're not doing something, if you're not making it clear that you're not okay, we need to talk, because we need to do something more than just being silent or putting our head down and pretending that we're not seeing it. And by the way, we're not just talking about intervening when you see an incident of sexual assault or domestic violence, by the way, most of which happens in private anyways. It's not that you have to observe something happening right in front of you. It's that all you have to do is be part of a peer culture where it's happening to somebody, somebody's doing it, somebody's experiencing it. And peer culture can be a small group of friends, it can be a team, it can be a school, it can be a workplace, it can be a community. If you're a member of the community, the peer culture in some way, what can you do to challenge and interrupt the enactment of abuse, verbal, emotional, physical, sexual, anything? What can you do to support the victims or the targets? And the beauty of that for men is it gives men a role to play who are not themselves abusive, right? Because again, most men will opt out of this conversation initially by saying, I don't rape women, so it's not my problem.
It doesn't concern me.
That doesn't concern me, right? And so I'm writing an essay right now. It's not a, I mean, I've been writing the same essay over and over again in some ways for the last 30 years, but it's like called Bystander Nation, about the United States, because basically elevating Donald Trump to the presidency and then re-electing him to the presidency. How can we say that tens of millions of people aren't co-signing on Donald Trump's misogyny? Because that's part of the package. When you vote for Donald Trump, you are voting for a man who has been found liable, not guilty in a criminal court, but liable in a civil court of sexual abuse. He's been alleged to have sexually assaulted something like 28 women. And there's who knows how many others that we don't know about. The Epstein files is a treasure trove of crazy and abuse. And one last thing about the Epstein files, can I just say, because I don't know how much you probably followed a little bit, right?
Yeah, we get things on the news.
Okay.
Sure.
I have a big problem with the concept of the Epstein class. Do you know that concept? Because what it does is it privileges class over gender, because it's not about a privileged international, transnational elite of men and a handful of women who are acting with impunity because that's how they walk through life, because they have so much power and privilege based on their class, right? Of course, that's part of it, but this is not a class-specific problem. Men's violence against women and sexual exploitation of girls and women is not a class-specific problem. And one of the things that I've written, other people have too, but I've certainly written 2 or 3 essays about this, is comparing and contrasting the Epstein files and the Epstein class thesis to the Pellico mass rape trial and situation in France. And if you look at the number, the 50 men who were convicted of raping Giselle Pellico, right? You know this case?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. They're described as ordinary men, a teacher, a coach, a soldier, a journalist, a nurse, et cetera. the subtext is that they're working class and that they're middle class, but their class is not really the focus. The focus is on their ordinariness and their individual men. And like, oh my God, all these ordinary guys who are doing this horrible thing, what's going on, right? Do you follow me in this? The contrast with the Epstein class is like, that's this transnational elites. It's like they're men in both cases exploiting women and girls. That's the most important story, not the class that they happen to inhabit. And I think that what happens by defining the Epstein class as an upper class phenomenon of transnational elites, it others them in a way that the average guys can dissociate ourselves. Oh, that's how those people act at the highest levels of power and privilege. Are you kidding me? That goes all the way from the poor to the wealthy and everywhere in between. Sexual violence and sexual assault and
so you're saying
violence.
It creates another excuse for men not to think that it's also about all men.
Yes,
instead of
including men on the left, by the way, because men on the left who are much more comfortable critiquing the wealthy than they are looking in the mirror.
I'm going to open up the conversation, as I promised, as we always do, to the public at this moment. If there's anybody who'd like to ask a question or come in, it's not mandatory. It's an option. And see whether we have any questions or remarks. And usually when there's first question, then there's more. I will be coming to you with the microphone in order for the people at home to hear the question. Yeah.
Dankjewel. Hi, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I was wondering, because in the beginning you said that you as a 19-year-old young man was interested in women's studies. Why do you think you were and a lot of other men that are 19 or maybe even 50 are not interested in this? Because I think that's also kind of the problem, maybe. I was wondering that.
Yeah.
Good, interesting question. So why was I interested in women's studies, and other men
weren't? Yeah.
Well, I often say that my interest was initially self-interest and not altruistic. It was because I was in high school. I was a really good athlete and like a star American football player, and so publicly I was successful, very successful in traditional terms, but I was conflicted about the difference between my public presentation and the private, reality of my life and my family and everything else. And I felt like I was trapped in a certain image and narrative that wasn't really comfortable. Even though, again, I have to say, I got a lot of the benefits. I'm not saying that I didn't get a lot of the benefits of being successful in the way that I was, but it wasn't sitting easy with me. I wasn't inarticulate about this. I didn't really understand it, but I was drawn to courses in my first year of university that had the word gender in the title. People back then, masculinity was not a word that was used very often at all, but the word gender was in the title of some of these courses, and I took the initiative to say, you know what, I would like to study this or talk about this. And I didn't intentionally go into being a women's studies, student. It was more like I wanted to learn about myself and my relationships with women and stuff like that. And again, I was inarticulate about the subject. And I quickly learned, very, very quickly learned, oh my God, there's a whole world of understanding here. And feminist ideas were the most powerful, explanatory force that I had ever encountered, especially about my own life. And this is an important thing, I think, for men to know. It's like feminism is obviously centering women and girls, but it's understanding gender in a way bigger than even just women and girls. And like, for example, one of the key feminist insights is that gender is one of the primary axes around which human societies are organized. To me, when I learned that, it was like obvious. Like it wasn't a controversial statement to me. It was like, this is just explaining that the ocean is blue and this and the grass is green. It's like gender is one of the primary axes that how societies are organized, which has as much implication for men's lives as it does for women's lives. And I got that early. And by the way, I was a philosophy major. Let me just be clear on that. And I visited the Baruch Spinoza statue, one of my pilgrimages when I came to Amsterdam. So I was a philosophy student, but I was the first man to minor in women's studies. Because eventually what became obvious was I had taken all the courses that were required for the women's studies on my own initiative. And a friend of mine, a woman friend of mine who was a women's studies minor, pointed out to me that I've taken all the courses. All I need is an advisor and write a short paper, and I can become a minor in women's studies. So it was something that I had already done for my own personal growth. But also, let me just also say, I also know and knew very early on that as a man learning about all of this, it wasn't enough to just learn about it and be more enlightened or educated or what have you. It was like, you got to do something with it. You know, like it's like a white person learning about, and I was learning about racism at the same time and heterosexism. I was learning all of this, and I was realizing that as a white heterosexual man, I was in a position to do something with this knowledge. It wasn't just like I was going to become smarter. It was like, okay, how am I going to take this knowledge and be somebody who makes a difference in the world? And I have to say, I was one of these young people, and maybe other people here, I was one of these young people who was ready to change the world. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, how can I make a difference? How can I do? And I thought there's nothing more that I could do than be a man speaking out about men's violence against women and working for gender equality intersectionally. There's nothing else that I could see doing in life that would be, to me, as meaningful as that. Because, by the way, gender inequality intersects with every other important issue in our species. Every single one. It's not an esoteric subject matter. It connected to everything. And I was fortunate enough to get that early and to get a really good education both in the classroom and in activist movements. And I've just ran with it the whole time since I was a 19-year-old.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yep. The lady over here.
First of all, I commend you for the book and the topic, the wonderful movie too. Thank you. I have a problem with the word sexual violence because sex is something else than sexual violence. There is no sex involved in sexual violence. It is. We really need another word for it. The fact that the act of sex more or less could involve the same act as in sexual violence, there is a difficulty there because sex, we should really talk about it, is consensual and sexual violence is not. So why don't we use another word there? Because sexual violence is not about lust. It is pure and simple about power. It is about wanting to be superior and trying to force that. What you are describing, by the way, and I really would like this to phrase in a bit of a different setting. We are in an increasing, a world with an increasing population. Real equality is very hard. It's very good especially if you're lower class or if you feel threatened by more women in this world and a different balance of power. It is superior. You want to feel superior. You want to feel better, and to use violence is the way to get that.
Would you have a suggestion for another word? Or
it is a type, I would say it's actually a power violence. Mm-hmm. You use power in whatever way you have, and it's including physical, in order to be on top in very beneficial ways.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate the point. I would say there is a distinction between sexualized power and non-sexualized power, because a man just beating up a woman would be using physical power, but the sexual part of it adds another dimension to it that is unique to that act. So, for example, why aren't men, if they want to just express power over women, why don't they just beat them up? They don't just beat them up. It's a sexualized form of power and domination. And by the way, men sexually assault other men as well, and it's a sexualized form of domination. So this is like the 70s slogan that's, rape is not about sex, it's about power. which is sort of what you're saying. I would say it's both at the same time. It's a sexualized form of power. You can't take one of. I personally think you can't separate the two, because then men would just be beating up women, and they're not just beating up women. They're sexually dominating them and using the sex act as the vehicle for a particular kind of expression of power. Yeah, absolutely. In addition, it's a weapon of war. In addition, but it's that they're not just beating up in the war zones. They're not just beating up the women. They're assaulting them sexually, right? There's a kind of violation. And people who, I'm not a clinician, but I know people who work with sexual abuse survivors. There might be people in this room who know more about this. There's a particular violation when it's sexual that's different than just being beaten up physically. Both of them are highly unpleasant experiences and traumatic experiences, but the sexual violation is another order of magnitude of violation, and that's the perpetrator knows this. So the perpetrator doing that is intentionally using a tool in their toolkit of domination that is explicitly distinct from how they would just beat up another man, for example. If they were going to rape a woman, that's even another degree of violation.
Interesting point. Interesting point, though. It's
issue.
complicated, and it's fundamental in a way as well. How you look upon love or sex as being consensual or not. It's interesting, yeah. But it's on purpose as well. You're right. I mean, it's not by coincidence that it's raping. It's consciously done often. Yeah.
Can I also not you didn't say this. I'm just saying that your question made me think of something that I feel like I should just say out loud here in Amsterdam. Coercion and power, right? There's lots of different ways of understanding how coercion works and how power works, including sexual power. If we want to talk about the pornography industry, the prostitution industry, there's all kinds of coercive power that is being mobilized in, whether it's legal or not, there's all kinds of ways of understanding these phenomena in terms of power and control and who has it and who doesn't have it, right? Whether something is legal or not is not the issue here. And this gets really tricky when you start talking about working with men, which is the focus of my work, really. I mean, I work with everybody, but in school districts and all kinds of other settings, so I'm not just somebody who just works with men. But I'm saying, if you start working with men, you'll get a lot of buy-in if you say it's important to speak out when you see a rape happening. Jump in and intervene, this whole bystander thing. Like, intervene when you see, a friend of yours is mistreating his girlfriend or something. What are you going to do? Most men and young men, I'm making a general statement, will say, yes, it's important for me to speak up. And, they'll say, rape is a horrible thing. Domestic violence, horrible thing. If I see it happening, I'm going to do something. But then you'll say, well, okay, what if you're hanging out with a group of guys and one or two of the guys start making misogynist comments about women and girls and women's bodies? Would you say something? And that's the same guy who might have just 2 minutes ago said that I would definitely intervene if I saw my friend committing a domestic assault, will say, no, wait a second. I'm supposed to tell somebody that what they can say and not say. I'm supposed to, decide what's fun, what's a joke and what isn't a joke, what's acceptable and not acceptable. What do you want me to be, the morality police? In other words, the same person who initially said that he would definitely speak up if he saw an act of abuse, when it comes to all the ways that sexism and misogyny become normalized and sexual exploitation becomes normalized, you're going to get all kinds of pushback, because guys will say, that's different. You know what I mean? What about free speech? What about free expression? What about, again, prostitution? I have the right to go. It's legal. There's going to be lots of conflict when you start looking at the base of the pyramid and all the ways that misogyny gets normalized in our societies. And if you're asking men to speak up and challenge each other, if you start addressing some of the day-to-day stuff, a group of guys, we're going to the strip club for a bachelor party, we're going to party. If you say that's not cool, dude. We're trying to create a rape-free culture, and that's going to support a culture of objectification of women, which helps to lead to an incredible level of sexual violence. You're going to get pushback, right?
Mm-hmm. There's another question over there. I'm coming to you.
Hi. Maybe related to this as well. I saw a video of one of the men who raped Gisèle Pelicot, and he said that he thought it wasn't rape. And also he said, I have a wife and kids, and I respect women a lot. So from your perspective, how do you kind of like, how would you explain this total dissociation? And also, it made me question, do men not know what rape is?
Well, thank you for the question. I would say one thing is, yes, there's been a dramatic desensitization, and one of the reasons is we have an incredibly pervasive porn culture, and the level of men's brutality and callous cruelty to women in heterosexual porn, and I'm talking about the mainstream of porn. I'm not talking about the fringes. I'm talking about the mainstream. So these young men who have been growing up over the last 30 years, not just 2 years ago. It's been a while. The level of brutality in mainstream porn marketed to heterosexual boys and young men has been extreme for decades now. So in other words, a lot of these guys' formative sexual socialization, men's brutality to women has been completely normalized. I hope you know this. This is just a fact. It's pretty pathetic. It's absolutely, to me, it's outrageous how normalized it's become. I'll give you an example, by the way. I talk about this in my book, Everyman. It's like, there's some study in the UK. I think it was from 2019, but forgive me if I'm getting some of the specifics wrong. There's a study in 2019 in the UK that something like 40% of women under the age of 30 in the UK who had been in heterosexual relationships had been non-consensually strangled by the man that they were having consensual sex with. And I use the word strangle. They don't use the word strangle. They use the word choke, which is a pornography term. The term in pornography is choking videos or whatever. It's strangulation, not choking. Choking is a euphemism. Strangulation. So the point I make in my book is that what that means, if something like 40% of women under the age of 30, have had this experience of non-consensual strangulation by the man that they're with, having consensual sex, that means that millions of men in the UK have non-consensually strangled the woman they're having sex with. And my argument in the book is, are we going to say that all those men are sick, that they're broken, that they had bad family, role modeling? I don't think that makes any sense at all, because most of the men doing this think that this is normal because they have consumed pornography where it has become normalized for them from the time that they went through puberty. And so that what they're doing is what they think they're supposed to do when you're having sex. So I'm not saying that I don't know, the various Pelico rapists. Let's be honest, a lot of those men are men who came of age in an era when the brutality of men's violence against women and sexualized violence against women in pornography has been normative. So some of them could literally be thinking that this is not really out of the realm of possibility. Now, I think, are they deluding themselves? Yes, but isn't part of the message of the Pelico rape case and so many others that this is not about individual pathology, that this is much more systemic? And isn't that the main message of the Pelico rape case? I think it is that there's another case in Germany, you probably know about this. What is 70,000 men were, do you know what I'm talking about? There was 70,000 men were part of a Facebook group or something that was, what's that?
Telegram group.
A Telegram group, which was what? Teaching them how to drug women or something? What was it? What was it? It was in Italy. No, I'm talking about the German one, but you talk about Italy?
It was in Italy. It says some. I'm translating it for the people at home. Otherwise, they won't hear anything. But yeah.
They were encouraged to film their own spouses or girlfriends.
Encourages to film their own spouse and girlfriends to while drugging them or raping them. Yeah.
It was tens of thousands of men doing
it's
this.
Totally amazing. Yeah.
So again,
I have a question
we can't
here.
run from one perpetrator to the next and try to figure out what went wrong with him, right? It's more systemic. Somebody, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question about the part you said before about mobilizing. And because you were here all with women, almost in the room, which already shows like, oh, maybe the men are not as interested or scared or bullied into staying silent, basically. But yeah, you said you've been decades in this conversation, and I maybe only, I just started the conversation, basically. And I don't want to engage anymore, but I do want to mobilize. And I wondered like where to start to mobilize, to really do something about this.
Thank you for the question. I mean, again, the point, I think, that, of my work, a big part of my work, and what I shared a little bit of tonight is this has to be understood as a political, an institutional, a cultural problem, and therefore the solution has to be thought of in those ways, and that the people who are in positions of leadership in a democratic society that have the right and the responsibility to make decisions about what are priorities in various institutions, in the educational system, in the sports culture. What are the training requirements? What are the requirements for people who are in positions of leadership at all levels of Dutch society, in every subculture, but also in the larger culture? This is what we have to do. We can't just be running from individuals, one individual to the next, and trying to change that person. We have to think about the ways in which, as a community, as a society, we're training our young people, if you will, or older people, to act and to interact and behave. Because, again, the way to get men in this room is not to, like, invite a male friend. You know what I mean? Like, a woman comes to an event, and I'm going to invite my friend who's a man because he should hear this. I mean, I appreciate that, but that's not how you make systematic social change on a problem as deep and broad as this one. You have to be much more ambitious than that. And again, I know it's easy for me to come here, as an American, I'm just like, you got to do this, you got to do this. It's like, it's a lot harder on the ground to make it happen in this country or any other, in my country. I mean, we're just trying to hold on for dear life in terms of democracy. And Yuri and I and some others were having dinner earlier, and we're talking about, am I going to get back into the United States? Are they going to let me back in through customs into my own country? I mean, it's scary, some of this stuff. But by the way, can I say something hopeful? Yuri and I mean, I'll present my position. Yuri can speak for himself, obviously. I think Donald Trump is the least popular president at this stage in his presidency of any president in the modern polling era. You have to know this. He's very unpopular in the United States, and it doesn't mean that he doesn't have an enormous amount of power and that he's using that power in incredibly destructive ways. But he's not popular. And one of the groups that his popularity has fallen the quickest is young men. And I started an organization, I co-founded an organization in early 2024 called the Young Men Research Project, because we knew what was happening with young men. We could see that young men were potentially sliding to the right and that were potentially going to vote for Donald Trump. And we were trying to raise the red flag, warning the Democratic Party, warning the journalistic establishment, you got to pay attention to men, young men, especially in this case, young men, white men, as well as young men of color. And of course, they weren't listening. The Republican Party outspent the Democrats 10-1 in outreach to young men. Donald Trump went on a series of podcasts with people like Joe Rogan, but a whole bunch of other ones. They weren't even talking politics mostly. It was just hanging out with the guys. The message to young men was the Republican Party likes you, cares about you, respects you, and the Democrats won't even give you the time of day. Anyways, 3 months into, they ended up flipping. The young men's vote, 18 to 29-year-old, ended up flipping 15 points from the 2020 election, where young men voted for Joe Biden by about 7 percentage points. And then the 2024 election, they voted for Donald Trump by 8 percentage points. So that's a 15-point switch in one election. Yes, there was a woman candidate. There was Kamala Harris and a woman of color candidate. So you could say that there's some racial and gender politics around that as well. I appreciate that. But the point, I think the hopeful point that I'm trying to make is 3 months into Donald Trump 2.0, when his polling started to go down, and it's continued to go down, the group that he lost the fastest was young men. And so media would call me and other people and ask, why do you think the young men's vote is so quickly, Trump is losing the young men's vote so quickly? And my response is, because it was based on nothing but vibes and image and narrative. There was no substance to it. Because, for example, 2/3 of young men support abortion rights, they support labor unions, they support action on the climate crisis, they support increase in minimum wage. All of this Donald Trump opposes, but they voted for Donald Trump. It's like, why would you vote for him if you were against him on all the issues? Because it wasn't about the issues, it was about this narrative piece. And so as the narrative shifts in the United States, as Donald Trump becomes increasingly weakened by his crazy decision-making and the MAGA coalition begins to fracture, I think what you're going to see happening, I hope what you're going to see happening, is more and more people are going to start feeling emboldened to criticize, him, because they've been bullied into silence up until now because of the awesome power of the presidency and the idea that if you oppose him, you're not a real man.
I draw to a close, I think. There are many more questions, I'm sure. Maybe we have time to address them in the bar. Maybe not. I'm very happy that you were here. Thank you very, very much for coming. In the first place, of course, our guest, Jackson Katz, for sharing his thought, for being open, and I salute you for your activism for a very long time. I think what you suggested to address these fundamental issues. One of them is being very careful about the language you use, and it's been also highlighted by one of our guests tonight, that it's important, how you speak about it and how you use your language. And I think another one is, I think, very inspiring, is to address it as a leadership problem of men, and in every leadership should be incorporated, the awareness of this. And I think what you just said about the election of Donald Trump, I think we need to speak to our peers and maybe young men, but men in general, about the next election, I think. And if I look at how the manosphere is being used by one of the parties who is running for election today, and also in a year time when there's provincial elections, I think that's very, very important, actually, because it leads towards these bigger movements, which can be very, very powerful in politics and actually become the winning party, even in the Netherlands. I mean, let's remember that not too long ago, the Forum for Democracy was the biggest party in our country as well. So thank you very, very much for sharing this with us. I think I take your book and what you said very personal, and I hope we're going to see you back. There's a Dutch translation of Every Man, I think in November, coming out, if I'm not mistaken.
We're going to present at a conference in November, a big conference with Jackson as the main speaker, and 3 master classes around that for special focus groups,
Towards somewhere in November, yeah, a big conference with master classes around the Dutch edition of it. Thank you very much, and hope to see you back, Jackson. Thank you very, very much.